Inside the Coptic Museum in Cairo, in Case 4 of the Permanent Manuscript Gallery, sits Nag Hammadi Codex II, shelf-locked since 1952. Each page averages 28.5 centimeters tall. No direct photography without a Ministry of Antiquities permit. White glove handling only. Page 1 of that codex names "The Error That Built the World You Live In." The text has been sitting here for 72 years. Most people have never heard a single line of it. Around 180 CE, a bishop named Irenaeus of Lyon made a decision. Condemned, copied, buried. He cataloged these texts as heresies, and the church that followed him spent the next 17 centuries ensuring they stayed invisible. Then came December 1945. A sealed clay jar near Jabal al-Tarif in Upper Egypt. A farmer's mattock cracked it open. 52 texts came out. 52 documents that Orthodox canon had officially declared dangerous for 1,700 years, recovered in a single afternoon. What those texts contain is not allegory. It is not mythology dressed in spiritual language. The Gnostic manuscripts describe a primary mechanic behind creation, one that Genesis does not name. Genesis is a secondary account. These texts record what came first, what went wrong, and what was assembled from that error. That is the literal thesis of the document sitting in Case 4 in Cairo. In the next several minutes, you will see the error named precisely, the demiurge identified by his own ignorance, and the architecture of the trap mapped from the original Coptic source material. The evidence is textual, measurable, and still readable today. If forbidden biblical history is the kind of record you want surfaced, subscribe now. Every week we bring up what the canon removed. The Apocryphon of John, Nag Hammadi Codex II, Tractate 1, translated by Marvin Meyer in 2007, housed and authenticated by the Coptic Museum in Cairo. This is not a paraphrase of Genesis. It is not a commentary on Genesis. It is an account of what happened before the event Genesis describes, and it names a specific moment when the structure of existence broke. The Coptic term used for that moment is plane. Most translations render it as error. That rendering is technically accurate and deeply incomplete. Plane does not mean sin. It does not carry the moral weight of transgression. It means deviation, a trajectory that moved sideways, a path that continued without correction because nothing was in place to correct it. The word is geometric before it is theological. It describes motion, not guilt. To understand why that matters, you need the pleroma. In Gnostic cosmology, the pleroma is the fullness, the divine totality from which all emanations proceed. Within that structure, every divine being exists in a paired relationship called a syzygy. Two counterparts bound together, their creative output stabilized by mutual correspondence. One does not act without the other. That pairing is not ceremonial, it is structural. It is the mechanism that keeps emanation within the boundaries of the pleroma itself. Sophia was one of the youngest eons within the pleroma. Her syzygy was Theletos, and according to NHC2, she acted without him. She produced an emanation, an act of creation, without the stabilizing counterpart the pleroma's architecture required. The text does not describe this as rebellion. There is no defiance in the account, no malice. What the text describes is something closer to an uncorrected impulse, a will that moved before its paired structure could engage. Here is where the text does something a 2nd century manuscript has no conventional explanation for doing. It describes the result of Sophia's uncoupled act as a self-sustaining deviation, something that generated consequence without an external cause driving it forward. The emanation produced output. That output produced further output, and nothing inside the system corrected the trajectory because the corrective element, the syzygy, had never been engaged. The loop had no stabilizing input. It ran on its own. Modern systems theory has a precise name for this: uncoupled oscillation. A system that generates output without the feedback mechanism required to regulate it. The stabilizing input is absent. The system does not collapse immediately. It continues, producing increasingly distorted results because the architecture is still partially intact. The deviation compounds. The output accumulates. And what accumulates is not nothing. That is the Century Bridge. A text written in the 2nd century CE, preserved in Coptic on leather pages averaging 28.5 centimeters tall, describes a dynamic that control theory would not formally define until the 20th century. The ancients called it plane, a sideways trajectory without correction. We call it uncoupled oscillation, a system generating output with no stabilizing input. Same phenomenon, 17 centuries apart. What Sophia's plane produced was not void. It was not darkness in the Genesis sense. It was something incomplete, something that had the impulse of divine origin, but lacked the structural integrity that paired emanation would have guaranteed. It was alive, it was generative, and it did not know what it was. That last detail is the one the text is most precise about. What emerged from Sophia's unauthorized emanation was not aware of what it lacked. It could not perceive the pleroma it had been severed from. It looked out at what surrounded it and saw only itself. And what was born from that incompleteness is where this gets precise. The document is Nag Hammadi Codex II, the first tractate, held in the Coptic Museum in Cairo under catalog designation NHC 2-1. The translation used by scholars worldwide is Frederick Wyss's 1977 rendering, cross-checked against Bentley Leighton's critical Coptic text. What it describes at the point of Sophia's emission is not symbolic. It is anatomical. The being that emerges is lion-faced, serpent-bodied, and radiant with fire. Those are the text's own terms, not metaphor, specification. The name given to this being is Yaldabaoth. Transliterated from Aramaic into Coptic, it carries two possible readings, and scholars have debated them for decades: Child of Chaos or Begetter of Sabaoth. Both readings point to the same condition: something born from disorder, carrying that disorder as its operating principle. The name is not an insult, it is a diagnosis. Now here is where the text becomes forensically strange. Yaldabaoth, severed from the pleroma, cut off from the fullness of divine light, looks out at what surrounds him, and he makes a declaration. The Coptic preserves it exactly. He says, "I am God, and there is no other." That phrase, that precise phrase, it is the same declaration attributed to the Creator in the Genesis tradition. The same words, the same absolute claim. The text is not making a casual comparison. It is making an identification. The God of Genesis and the ignorant architect of the Gnostic cosmology are presented as the same being. He had no way to know what he was missing. That is the impossible knowledge beat embedded in the text itself. A being cut off from the pleroma cannot perceive the pleroma. He cannot measure his own deficiency because the instrument of measurement was the very thing removed. He sees only what he has. He assumes it is everything. And from that assumption, he builds. Quantum cosmology has a model for this. It is called the false vacuum. In the standard model of particle physics, a false vacuum is a lower energy state that is locally stable. It cannot perceive the true ground state because it has no access to it. It behaves exactly as though it is the base reality. It generates structure. It follows its own rules, and those rules are internally consistent. The problem is that they are built on a foundation that is not what it believes itself to be. The model was formalized through the work of Sidney Coleman and Frank DeLucia in their 1980 paper published in Physical Review D. A system that cannot see beyond its own energy level will always mistake that level for the floor. Yaldabaoth is a false vacuum with agency. That is not a metaphor. That is the operational description the text provides. A being of incomplete information, generating a cosmos from the only blueprint available to him. A blueprint he cannot fully read because the light required to read it is the same light he lost. From that incomplete reading, he constructs 7 archons. The text names them individually. Each one governs a layer of the fabricated cosmos. 7 layers, 7 administrators, 7 systems of containment, built by a being who does not know he is replicating a structure he has only partially seen. The architecture is real, the archons function, but they are built from misread instructions. And then the text specifies what Yaldabaoth used as raw material. It does not leave that detail vague. It names the substance. It names the source. And what he built with it is still present, inside the thing he constructed. The question is, what he did with it next. The Gospel of Truth, Nag Hammadi Codex 1, Tractate 3. Housed in the Coptic Museum in Cairo, catalogued as NHC 1-3. The translation used by the majority of scholars is Harold Attridge and George McCrae's rendering, published in 1985 as part of the Coptic Gnostic Library Project. The text is Valentinian, meaning it belongs to the school of Valentinus, the 2nd century Alexandrian theologian whose system was considered the most sophisticated and the most dangerous of the Gnostic traditions. It was targeted specifically by Irenaeus of Lyon in his 2nd century refutation. Irenaeus called it a seduction. That tells you something about how precisely it landed. The Gospel of Truth does not tell a story. It performs a diagnosis, and the entity it diagnoses has a name. In the Greek underlying the Coptic, that name is hamartema. Translators often render it as error, but that rendering loses the mechanical precision of the original term. Hamartema does not mean moral failure. It does not mean sin in the theological sense that centuries of interpretation have layered onto it. It means a miss, a mechanical miss, an arrow that left the bow at the wrong angle. The trajectory was set at the moment of release, and the deviation was structural, not intentional. The archer did not choose to miss. The arrow was simply wrong from the start. The text pairs hamartema with a second term, hysterema. This one is even more precise. Hysterema means deficiency, not absence in the casual sense, structural absence, a gap where fullness should be. The pleroma, the divine fullness, inverted into its own negative. Hysterema is what you get when completeness is subtracted from itself, and the remainder tries to function as though nothing was removed. The Gospel of Truth's operational description of what error does with this deficiency is exact. It says, error built a substitute for truth. Not a lie, not a deception in the conscious sense. A substitute, a replacement structure erected in the space where the original was missing. Error does not know it is error. That is the impossible knowledge beat the text encodes. A system generating a world model from incomplete signal cannot flag its own incompleteness. It treats the substitute as the original, because the original is the very thing it cannot access. Neuroscience arrived at this same architecture in the 21st century. The model is called predictive processing. The framework was developed and formalized by Carl Friston at University College London, building on earlier work by Hermann von Helmholtz in the 19th century and Andy Clark's 2016 synthesis in Surfing Uncertainty. The core finding is this: the brain does not perceive raw reality. It constructs a world model from prior expectations and updates that model only when prediction errors become too large to ignore. The sensory data does not drive the model. The model drives the interpretation of the sensory data. What you experience as reality is a best guess confabulation, generated from incomplete signal, treated as ground truth. The ancients called it hysterema. We call it perceptual confabulation. Same mechanism, different century. The gospel of truth gives this mechanism coordinates. It does not leave error as an abstract force. It locates it. It traces its function. It describes the structure of the substitute world error erected, and then it names where the exit from that structure is hidden. That coordinate is not symbolic. The text is precise about where the signal capable of breaking the substitution actually originates. And that origin is where the trap becomes something far more specific than a cosmological metaphor. The passage is in Nag Hammadi Codex 2, first tractate, at the 19th sequence of the text. The same document, the same catalog. Frederick Wyss's translation, cross-referenced against Leighton's critical Coptic edition. What it describes is an act of theft that the thief did not fully understand. Yaldabaoth breathes into the body he has constructed. The Coptic term used is pneuma. Translators render it as breath, and that rendering is accurate as far as it goes. But in the Coptic Gnostic context, pneuma carries a second and more precise meaning. It is not just breath, it is the living light particle. A discrete quantity of pleroma light that Yaldabaoth had absorbed from Sophia's original emission, and now exhales into the material form he has built. Not metaphor, a quantity, a measurable portion of divine light, transferred from an ignorant architect into a counterfeit body. He had no authority to hold it. The text is explicit on that point. The pneuma was not his to keep. It was not his to transfer. But the transfer happened, and the counterfeit body, built from misread instructions by a being of incomplete information, became its cage. The light was inside the architecture of containment, trapped not by design from above, but by the structural accident of a blind god who did not know what he was handling. A 2nd century text describes coherent light trapped inside matter by an agent who did not understand what he possessed. That is the impossible knowledge beat, and it sat in that codex, in that cedar dry cave outside Nag Hammadi, for 17 centuries. In 1976, a German biophysicist named Fritz Albert Topp made a measurement. Working at the University of Marburg, Popp detected coherent light emissions from living cells. Not heat radiation, not chemical fluorescence, coherent light. Organized, phase-correlated photon emissions in the range of 10 to 1,000 photons per square centimeter. He called the phenomenon biophotonic coherence. The emissions were not random. They behaved like a signal, like an internal communication system operating below the threshold of conventional biochemistry. Subsequent research confirmed the findings across multiple independent laboratories through the 1980s and 1990s. The ancients called it the divine spark. Popp called it biophotonic coherence. Same phenomenon, different century. The archon's function becomes clear at this point in the text. They are not creators. The text never calls them creators. They are administrators, governors of layers. And what they govern is containment. The 7-layer structure Yaldabaoth built from his misread blueprint is not a cosmos in the Platonic sense of an ordered beauty. It is a containment architecture. And the pneuma, the coherent light particle now housed inside material form, is what is being contained. But the text does not end at the lock. It names the exit, and the coordinates it gives for that exit are the strangest detail in the entire document. Nag Hammadi Codex 2 sits in the Coptic Museum in Cairo today, photographed, cataloged, publicly cited in Marvin Meyer's 2007 critical edition. The Coptic terms hamartema and hysterema appear in any interlinear Nag Hammadi concordance, checkable this afternoon. The suppression itself is documented. Irenaeus, Adversus Heresies, Book 1, written 180 CE, still in print. These are not contested facts. They are standing records. And right now, the mechanism the text described is still running. The counterfeit world still self-reports as real. The error still presents itself as the only architecture available. A text written 1800 years ago named that mechanic. The coordinates it left behind have never been sealed. If what they buried troubles you more than what they kept, leave that below. And subscribe. These are the texts that were never meant to surface.